Hi, everybody. Nice to see you all today. My name is Mandy. I'm from Designlab's team, and I'm really here just to introduce the webinar today. The bulk of the webinar will be hosted by Kieran Black, who is one of our mentor advocates, and he'll be taking you through the design trends of 2020. The way that this webinar will work is we will hear from Kieran first, and once he has finished speaking to us about everything he's prepared, we will then move over to answering any questions that you might have. So whilst Kieran is talking and as things pop into your minds, please make sure that you pop any questions that you do have into the questions tab. You'll see it at the top right-hand corner of your screen. Also, please make sure to introduce yourselves to us in chat. Let us know where you're from. We'd love to hear from you, and we want to make sure that we're designing these webinars so that they work the best way possible for you. It's really great to see many returning faces. It looks like you guys are really enjoying these and getting a lot out of them. Please let us know either way. We'd love to hear again how these are working for you and the kind of topics that you'd like us to cover in future. So thank you, and thank you, Kieran, for joining us today, and I will be handing over to you now.
No worries. Hey, everybody. Kieran again. I'm going to jump right into this one because I know this one actually has a lot of questions that a lot of people ask. So I'm going to keep the presentation quite short and open it up to discussion. So as Mandy said, if you've got questions, chuck them in the questions column right next to the chat right there. And we can try and do that as best as possible. So I'm going to enable my screen sharing and get my application window here. And I'm also going to switch it over to Figma. All right. And one lucky last thing is I'm going to mute my notifications so I can keep getting that little popping sound. All right. So as I sort of said, or as Mandy sort of said, this is going to be about like design trends and like what we sort of see coming up for tools specifically. So today's topic is really going to be about what UX UI tool should I use in 2020. So the very first question that we like sort of get quite a lot is this exact one, because this is the kind of one that sort of like makes you go down one path or another. It can even make you buy like a Mac, for example, if you're thinking that Sketch is the one for you. So I want to sort of go through that and help people find what tool they're going to be using. And specifically for 2020, as trends change and our tools change with it, I want to bring those up and sort of show you what's been happening in the last like year or so, as well as what I think will be happening in the future. As I mentioned, the talk's going to be around 30 minutes. Q&A is going to be around 30 minutes. So as always, ask questions in that questions tab. All right, let's dive in. So what do I mean by what UX UI tool should I use in 2020? Well, the main thing here is we use a lot of tools when it comes to designing for apps, for websites, for services, for like visual UI, for audio UI, for VR, for AR, so on and so forth. There's so many different ways that we could cut and dissect that sort of like question, like what UX UI tool are we going to be using? But what I really wanted to focus on is the wireframing aspect, the UI design aspect, and the prototyping aspect. As you can sort of see, we can also do brainstorming, ideation, user flows, sitemaps, handoff tools, user testing, design system, file management, task management. If you don't know what these terms mean just yet, that's perfectly fine. If you're like new to the course and you're not quite there yet, these things will happen throughout like a UX designer's journey when creating something for a company or for themselves. So let's look at what are some of our options when it comes to this. So the tools of the trade, if you will. So obviously, like most people have heard of the word sketch. If they're like looking at UI UX at all, they're looking at probably the three big ones. So Sketch, Figma, and Adobe XD. So Sketch is a really great tool. It started off as a vector-based tool, so it was really meant for like illustrations and icon design, and then slowly found its footing in the UI UX sort of field and atmosphere. Then it sort of it is a Mac only application. It doesn't really have that much of a web component, so that is something to consider. And as you can sort of see, the other two are not Mac only. So let's click into those. So we've got Figma, which came around end of 2016. So I think it was like November 2016, somewhere around there. So it actually hasn't been around for that long, and yet it actually has quite a following at the moment. And the reason why I think this one has been so successful in the last couple of years has been that it's been web first, meaning that very similar to how Google Docs came along and sort of disrupted like Microsoft Word and all of those kinds of things. It went from a file-based local, like being on your local machine, on your computer. So you can say like, I've got a .doc file, like on my file, on my system, to everything being in the cloud. So everything being like, I just log into something and then it's there, and all the latest updates are there. It's always auto saved because 9 times out of 10 I'm connected to the internet. So Figma takes that a very similar approach. It removes the need for physical files, although you can still create those if you wish. And it connects it to the internet as much as possible, so that you can do that. And it also includes a thing called multiplayer, which again is very similar to the Google Docs movement of being able to edit the same exact file at the same exact time, which is really, really great for one, for productivity, two, for file management, because that's a nightmare when you're working with any more than one person, and even just one person can be a nightmare. And yeah, like that's what Figma is all about. So let's jump on to Adobe XD. So Adobe XD, as the name suggests, is created by Adobe. Adobe's been around for a very, very long time. Adobe XD, I think, again, like had a very, it hasn't been around for as long. Fun fact, I used to be on the alpha team when it used to be called Project Comet, way, way back in the day. And it's come a long way since then. There are a lot of like cool features that XD has got. But yeah, there's something about Adobe XD that a lot of people aren't really loving out there, like in terms of like big companies. So it's quite interesting that although XD has a lot of features, it's still not taking off as much as something like Figma or Sketch. So yeah, very interesting. All right, so let's look back a little bit at a few of like there's a great site called uxtools.co, and what they do since 2017, what they've done is every single year they've gone and surveyed a whole bunch of people and said, from around the world, not just like US centric, they've said, okay, tell us everything about what kind of tools are you using? Like what kind of tools are you using for wireframing? What type of like tools are you using for brainstorming, and so on and so forth? And they've been collating that over 2017, 2018, and 2019. So the most recent one was late, I think it was like in December of 2019. So what we can then sort of like look at that, we can go back and look at what the trends were over the last couple of years. So I won't bore you with all of it, But if you're interested, I definitely would have a look at 2017, 2018, and 2019. The links are there. They're also in the chat at the very, very top. And so are all the other links that I'll be talking about today. So if you are like excited to look at any of the tools that I'm talking about, or excited about any of the links that I'm talking about, they're all there in the top of the chat. All right, so let's have a look at specifically the 2019 one, because I think that's going to be the obviously the most of interest to all of you. So let's jump into that one. So as you can sort of see, like Taylor is the guy that runs this thing, and he's put together like an overall table of contents here to sort of like show you what's going on. So he's got like the demographics. So it's very much quantitative data. So it's not anything about like why it's such a good tool or anything like that. It's just pure like or worse yet, like it's the only tool available that does the thing that I want. So I'm sort of forced to use it. It's simply quantitative. So it's like, do I use it? Yes or no, right? And that's something to bear in mind when looking at these demographics and any of these results. So what he goes through is brainstorming, ideation, user flows, sitemap tools, wireframing, UI design, prototyping, handoff, user testing, design system, file management, and then he does a recap at the very end. But like I said, we're going to really focus on number 4, 5, and 6. So let's jump right to those, and let's sort of like have a look at what is going on here. So when we have a look at these, we can sort of see like in a pure quantitative aspect that Sketch is outweighing Figma and Adobe XD in that order. So what I sort of like get from this is that, and if you also look at the raw data, because raw data, he actually does provide that if you're interested, if you're a numbers geek. He sort of like gives the ability for people to say that they use multiple tools. So it's not just like one tool and that's it. So what you'll sort of see when you're looking at these numbers, if I go back to wireframing tools, is that if it'll let me, which it won't, so I'm going to just scroll back down. Because I've done that, you can sort of like see that these numbers, if added together, don't actually make up that 3,000. It's a little bit more than that 3,000, but that's all right. I mean, it just means that people are using multiple tools to get the job done. So as you can sort of see, the Sketch, Figma, Adobe XD kind of pattern will start to emerge here. Same with UI design tools. So we've got Sketch, Figma, Adobe XD. And then if we keep going past it as well, you can also see that they've broken it down by UI design tools for Mac, and they've also done UI design tools for Windows. I think the people who are using Windows on, Sketch on Windows are either one, confused, or using like something like Boot Camp or something like that. To do like a virtual PC on their Mac, or even using a Hackintosh or something like that. So yeah, so as you can sort of see, Sketch and Figma, and then Figma when you're using Windows is still like pretty on par with Adobe XD, to be honest. But then we've got Figma over here as well. All right, and then UI design tools based on team size. So this is quite interesting if you're looking to apply to bigger companies like Facebook or Shopify or something like that, right? That you can sort of see that a lot of people who are in the smaller teams are using a lot of Sketch, right? And then bigger teams like that trend sort of still goes, but as you can sort of see that it stays with the whole Sketch, Figma, Adobe XD sort of trend across all of those. But yeah, and then we've also got prototyping tools, and we've got Sketch, InVision, Figma, and Adobe XD. So the reason why I think InVision is snuck into there is because Sketch's prototyping tools up until recently haven't been like that great. and so there's sort of still like a gap between what Sketch can do and what an InVision can do, and therefore there's sort of like a lot of people who are using Sketch are also using InVision as sort of like a backup tool if they need it, and that's why I think the numbers are so very close. Like I haven't like filtered through every single like piece of that raw data because there's a lot of it, but that's my gut feeling there. So take that with a grain of salt. But Figma has its own prototyping tool as well as Adobe XD as well. So and they're a lot more advanced than what Sketch has currently. So I think that's why they still perform quite well on their own without the need of InVision. But what also is quite interesting is this prototyping through the years. So this is actually like 2017, 2018, and 2019. And we can sort of see that Sketch is on the rise here. We can also see Adobe XD and Figma are also on the rise. So we can sort of see Adobe, this purple line is going up and up and up slowly. And then we've got Figma up and up and up as well. But what's really interesting is this decline in InVision. So this isn't InVision Studio. This is the InVision Classic. So this is like where you take screenshots or like you import from the artboards of Sketch or Figma for that matter, and you import them into InVision, and then you wire them up inside of InVision's tool. So that to me is an indicator that a lot of people are moving away from InVision for something like Sketch, for something like Figma that does it all in the one tool. So as Sketch's tool becomes better and better, like in terms of prototyping, I think that number will increase as well as Figma's as well as XD's. What also is of note here is InVision Studio is an entirely separate product. It's actually closer to like what Sketch, Figma, and Adobe XD is, where it's a UI tool first and a prototyping tool second. So very much like Sketch and Figma and Adobe XD, where they are trying to make a design tool that you can use that then goes into prototyping within the same tool. So I'm interested to see where that ends up going in the next coming years. All right, then we've got handoff tools and so on, but I won't get into that just yet. But what I wanted to sort of like talk about is what is the future here, right? Like what are the things that are coming up? So looking forward, as I can sort of see here, is that there is a lot of like competition with Sketch, like Adobe XD and Figma. So I think the immediate future is that those three are just going to keep like going at it. And InVision Studio might step up their game to get a lot more people on board, or they might. InVision has a lot of, it's VC backed quite a bit, so they might go and buy another studio because they bought Macaw a couple of years back, which is very similar to something like Webflow, where it's a visual designer, but you can actually make real sites out of it and stuff like that. So yeah, they might look to acquire some more talent that way, or they might do something else to establish a foothold in that industry. Right now, they're a little bit lower than where I'd expect them to be, but I think the main three that isn't going to change for 2020 is Sketch, Figma, and Adobe XD, unless someone comes along and just blows them out of the water. But that's very unlikely at this point. I haven't heard any rumors about any of those kinds of things coming up. So that kind of stuff, like that's what I'd be focusing on, is one of those three. But I'm also going to talk about where I sort of see UI design in general going, because as I mentioned, there's a lot to it, right? There's a lot that we're not even looking at when we're looking at something like Sketch and Figma and Adobe XD. They sort of cover wireframing, UI design, and prototyping. But as you sort of saw from the previous slide, there's a lot of different other traits that it could be doing as well. And this is sort of like where I look into the future and sort of like look at things like Airbnb's design like team. They have a lot of like cool tools. They're always like thinking about the future. And admittedly, a lot of other companies are too as well. But like I find that Airbnb actually like talks about them out in the open a lot more than any other company. I'll just show a quick demo of like what Airbnb design does, with their like sketching interfaces. So what they created was, if you can sort of like watch this quick video, and I'll sort of explain what's happening, is they actually wrote this this React app essentially that scans, like uses the webcam. And then looks for something that is a wireframe, and then it translates that into something of their existing like design system. So some of their existing components that they already use. So I'll play that again. So over on the right-hand side is a hand-drawn thing. It's then boldened by the machine learning, and then it does like a whole bunch of like diffs to try and figure out like what is a box, what isn't a box, so on and so forth, and then translates that into something that will actually be used in a real life. And over on the left-hand side, this isn't just like a picture of it. This is like the actual real app, right? So this is like the actual like thing that you could ship out to like an iOS or an Android version or a web version. So this is crazy. This is going from literally a hand-drawn thing to exported code. And that's sort of where I see a lot of the future going, where we create the initial design system using a whole bunch of different tools and that kind of thing. But a lot of this like frees us almost from like pushing pixels around a whole lot. It allows us to use pre-existing components that we can go ahead and create, and then use and reuse what we already have to make everything cohesive and make everything a lot faster and a tighter turnaround. Other tools, so very similar to like not similar to this, but these three here have a similar sort of goal in mind, where up until now, the single source of truth, quote unquote, for design has always been like the Sketch file, the Figma file, the Adobe XD file, right? So if it's in the design file, it should be like that in the development, like in the actual real life thing, right? And there's a lot of problems with that. And that's what a lot of these kinds of companies like Clutch, Modules, and Interplay. Clutch actually recently changed their name. They used to be called, like, I can't remember, it's like starting with an S. But they actually like all do very much the same thing, where they work with developers a whole lot to try and figure out the best way to create your design system, and then use like an application as well to then very much looks like Figma and Sketch, but it allows them to bring in design, like coded like components into something like that looks like Figma or Sketch, right? So the actual single source of truth is in code rather than in like a bunch of pixels. So what I mean by that is that because you've taken the time to code it, it's actually going to be more accurate. Like everything is going to be the right size and everything like that. It's a lot harder to screw up a variable that's used throughout the whole site, whereas we can miss something by 1 pixel just by simply tapping like the arrow key, right? So that kind of thing removes the the human error to it. So again, like if you're interested in any of this kind of topics, I would suggest looking into Clutch.io, Modules app, Interplay app. They're all in a beta at the moment. So I don't see this like they may launch in 2020, but I don't see them sort of like really taking off until maybe late 2020, early 2021, and maybe even into 2022, when people are also starting to think like this a little bit more mainstreamly. So if you have a look at these websites, as you can sort of see, it looks a little bit like crazy because there's a lot of code and all that kind of stuff. But what they actually did is you grab a bit of text, you grab a block, and then you like smash them together, and then you essentially make a component out of that. And then you then have all of these like components that you have that you can then simply just click and drag them in as you need them. Right, very similar to like what you would have if you created your components in Figma, except the core of it is actually coming from the code rather than the core of it being on a Figma file. So as you can sort of see, like this also works with React. So this is using like live data. So it's not like lorem ipsum or anything like that. You can actually use like APIs and all that kind of stuff. So you can get real data in your real interface. So instead of like faking it a whole lot, like that's where I sort of like see this going. Work together in real time without handoffs. So again, like they're trying to get this multiplayer thing started. It's kind of a trend at the moment to break down that barrier of trading files back and forth and getting into that. And reusable components, pretty much the same thing here. And then same with modules. Again, like you've got like the code underlying, but as you can sort of see, the UI actually looks a lot like something like Figma or something like Sketch, right? So the source of truth is the code, but that sort of like takes the code into the design and makes sure that everything is up to date all the time. And then you've got like a whole bunch of people talking about it, blah, 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 blah. So definitely a good like Twitter follow if you're into that. And then the one of the co-founders, Colin Twit, and have a look at his stuff as well. And then lucky last, there's actually quite a few of these kinds of tools that are out and about at the moment. These are just the three that are making the most noise at the moment. So Interplay is also a great app. I've actually been like had a look at their beta. Like I had a chat with a few of the guys that are working there, and yeah, it's actually a really great tool. Like I do think that this also has a really good place for UI designers. So again, it actually like takes it from almost like an understanding of here's all of my components, and I would then want to create an interface based on that. So again, working with developers, like making that loop tighter, understanding like what the best way to create a component is, create it in code, then suck it into your design tool of choice to then lay out however you want it to be laid out. And again, import your code components and design tokens, design with your code components in Figma and Sketch. So they're actually like right now, they've actually got a plugin for Figma and Sketch where you can grab your component tools, your coded components right now and actually drag and drop them in. If you want to use your own version of that, you do have to like sign up to the beta, but they do have some like default ones that are in there. So you can sort of see how it works. It's a little bit janky at the moment, but that's because they haven't built Figma. They're trying to like use someone else's tool and import their tool. So there's going to be problems. But again, like this whole sort of like working like with the coders, like working with actual code and then importing that into something that is friendly, like that isn't like, it doesn't give you that high barrier of entry, actually is a really cool thing to do. So again, overall, like this stuff is not a 2020 trend. I sort of see this as going into late 2020 and into early 2021. And I also think this is going to be something that is going to be there for the bigger companies, right? So the Facebooks, the Shopifys, like the Apples, like of the world, right? Like the much bigger companies. So yeah. So let's jump into the next one. So what is my recommendation for 2020? Like what should like I as a designer do, like coming into this either fresh or like I'm coming in from like graphic design into this and like what should I do? The bad news is that it depends. When I say this to some of my students, they just go, "Oh, really? Like it depends. Like you can't just give me a straight answer." And the problem with that is that, as you sort of saw, some places are actually like equally split as to what they're going to be using for Figma or Sketch or Adobe XD for that matter. So it largely depends on the kind of company that you're going to work for, and like what that is going to that is going to largely dictate. Because if you're using Figma and the rest of the team is using Sketch, they're going to say learn Sketch. Like you've got to be on Sketch with us, kind of thing. But the good news is if you learn one, it's very easy to learn the other. What a lot of people don't realize is that they actually share about like 90 to 95% of the same DNA, right? So a lot of the same sort of things exist. Like there's a canvas, on the left-hand side, there is a layers list. On the right-hand side, there's an inspector tool. Like they all have like understandings of like what a component is. So Sketch calls them symbols, Figma calls them components, and Adobe XD calls them components. And then they all have understandings of styles, like layer styles, text styles, so on and so forth. They all have understandings of like external libraries so that you can import and export your styles to other files if you so wish. They all have a lot of the same features, except they're all slightly different in their own little quirks and ways. So like I said, if you learn one, it's very, very easy to learn the other. I was like, this sort of like leads on to like my personal recommendation, like what I use, which is, it is actually Figma right now. I've been using Sketch since early 2016. So the last three and a half years. And then up until like I went freelance, I've actually started using Figma for everything. Even this presentation is in Figma right now. So I've been using it not because it's like quote unquote the best tool ever, but in the way that it works with my workflow. So I use Notion for a lot of my stuff, and Notion is a web-based tool. Notion is sort of like a note-taking app, as well as like a whole bunch of different things rolled into one. But really, it's a way for me to like communicate with other people on different teams, as well as communicate or just write down things. And Figma actually has like a live embed tool inside of that. So it actually works well with that. And Figma also works well with, because it's web first, it is doing a lot of like web native things, meaning like it can do like an iframe on a website. So for example, I have Kieran Black slash frame was it Figma test, I think is the name. Test Figma. It's probably test Figma, knowing me. Yeah. Let's just switch those around. Test. Still can't find it. I'll link that to somewhere else, somewhere down the line. But essentially, you can include your Figma prototype. Figma. I keep getting it confused with Framer. It's really annoying. So you can put in your Figma prototype inside of your website without like any sort of like extra effort at all. You can do the same sort of thing with Sketch by importing it over to the cloud and then doing like maybe a video recording. but there are some things where you just want to show off that Figma prototype in where it's at. Now it's time for Q&A. So we've gone over a little bit for the time, but I really wanted to like open this up because I really wanted to I know that there's going to be a lot of questions about all of this, like what if this and what if that. So hit me with all of your questions. I want to answer as many as I possibly can. So I'll hand it over back to Mandy.
Great, thanks, Kieran. I'm going to run through the questions first that have got the highest number of upvotes, just to make sure we cover those off. And any questions we don't get around to answering in the remaining time, please just let us know. Email us, get hold of us in some way. hello@trydesignlab.com is always a really good place to start, and we'll make sure to try and get that information to you. So starting at the very top, the first question is, as someone totally new to design and based on the trend of programs combining code with UX design, would you recommend learning code in addition to design?
It depends on what your overall goal is. So what I mean by that is there's a really great talk by Jared Spall where he talks about everybody is like a broken comb, right? So if you think about like a comb, it has like a lot of teeth and it's sort of like a lot of different things. And if you think about all of those teeth as being like a little, like a skill that you have. So one of them might be like coding. One of them might be like specifically like UI design or typography, or like understanding like market, understanding like business and all those different types of things. If you think about like all your different skills, different people are going to have different skills over time. So what I don't suggest is learning it straight away. Like I don't think it should be like the thing you learn tomorrow, but there are tools that will help you like move forward in that. So what I mean by that is there are things like Webflow. Webflow is a very like visual way to start to learn how to like not necessarily code, but understand how code works. And then you can sort of like level up from there. I also suggest to a lot of my students who are interested in code to use something like Team Treehouse. So I'll put a link to that in there. So if anybody else is interested, teamtreehouse.com. So I'm going to copy and paste that URL and put that into the chat as well. And paste that in there. So Team Treehouse is a really great way to sort of like learn coding. It does have it's actually quite cheap. It does do a lot of cool stuff. It's very much like video led. There isn't like a mentor experience like we do have at Designlab. I think they do. Like I think they are trying to trial that out at the moment. But yeah, the whole thing there is that it's actually they take you down like a guided path as to what you should learn as a coder coming into HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and the basics of that. So if you're interested in that, like I would go and maybe like they do have a free trial for 7 days, and then I think it's like $25. Don't quote me on that, but I think it's like around $25 a month. So it's actually quite cheap in the grand scheme of things. So yeah, have a look at that and let me know how you go. But I do not think it's essential like in your first year or first 2 years. As time goes on, you will learn code. It's just a fact of life. If you're an architect, you're going to learn about physics, right? Like you're going to be there for it. You're going to have to learn how certain materials work. You can't just sit behind like your blueprints all day. You have to actually know how the thing is going to get built. So same sort of thing applies here. So it's just a matter of time, unfortunately.
Awesome. Thanks, Kieran. The next question is, I have seen many prototypes with animations online. Which app do you think is best for creating animations?
Well, overall, I would probably say After Effects, but that doesn't. There's a lot of tools that do like generative art as well. So what I mean by that is you can actually set like functions so that different things like come up and all that kind of stuff. So you can sort of like set one thing and then it sort of like dictates how 20 other things interact as well. So generative art is actually really cool. And I think that is a big trend of 2020 as well. But in terms of like animation tools, you've got After Effects, like that's going to be your number one. There's the most tutorials about it. There's the most there's the most sort of like following behind it. Like it's quite a big tool, and it's used in so many different ways that it's crazy. Figma actually has this thing called Smart Animate, which if you've ever used like Keynote, it's very much the same way that they do the animation in Keynote, where you go from frame to frame, and then whatever changes in between those two frames, it tries to tween between. So if it starts off as a small rectangle over here, and then a bigger rectangle over here, and then this one's red, this one's blue, it will try to like grow to be that size, as well as do the color fade change between the two. So yeah, probably start off with something like Figma. Principle also does the same thing. Principle for Mac, as the name suggests, it's for Mac only at the moment. And I don't think that the guy is going to do a PC app anytime soon. So if you're on a PC, I would suggest, Adobe XD as well as Figma both have some pretty cool animation tools to it. But if you really want to go above and beyond, After Effects is probably the best way for that.
Great. So the next question comes in two parts. The first is, if we're used to PC and have been focusing on learning Figma, is it worth investing in a Mac to become familiar with Sketch? And the second part of the question is, will employers have a preference for Sketch versus Figma and Adobe XD, or are the basic skills transferable between design tools?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, yeah, like you definitely will have to like conform to whatever the place says, unless you're the only designer there, in which case you can say, hey, I've been using Figma or I've been using Adobe XD and I want to go from Sketch to that, right? Or vice versa, right? So that's the only time where you'll have sway as a junior designer is if you're the only designer. If you're working with a whole bunch of other designers, unfortunately, you sort of have to state your case to them, and they will have to work with you and try and figure out what is the best way forward. But yes, answer to the second question first. Yes, they will have a preference, and yes, like the skills are transferable. Like I said, 90 to 95% of like they share the same DNA. Very, very easy to switch between. And worth investing in a Mac to become familiar with Sketch. I don't think so, because the skills are so transferable, right? If you're using a PC, like it's absolutely fine to use Figma, and to use that. What I wouldn't suggest is staying on a PC and going with Adobe XD. As you sort of saw, the numbers aren't quite there for Adobe XD. But like, again, the skills are transferable. Even if you do everything in Adobe XD and then you go for an interview and they're like, do you know Figma or do you know Sketch? And you're like, yeah, sure. And do the shifty eyes, right? You want to say yes to that and then learn the crap out of it on the weekend. Like, I think it's very, very possible to do that, is to take the weekend, learn it, and then like understand the differences between what Figma and Sketch offers, or Adobe XD and Figma, or Adobe XD and Sketch, whatever the case may be.
Great. So regarding Figma, do coders end up using the tools solely, or do they use more tools to bring the prototypes from Figma to life?
Do coders end up using that tool solely, or do they use more tools to bring the prototypes to life? I mean, it depends on how they are creating the code. So what I mean by that is like when you're creating something, like you're going to be like if you're creating a design system, for example, right? So we want to create a whole bunch of colors, a whole bunch of typography styles, a whole bunch of different styles to then create like spacing variables and all that kind of stuff to create a button, right? So that's a first level component. That button then has a whole bunch of variables inside of it, right? If you were to take simply what Figma gives you, it just tells you that the button is maybe 200 pixels wide, 48 pixels high. The font is 16 and semi-bold and white, and then the button color is blue and it's 4 pixels rounded, right? It doesn't give you all of the padding and stuff like that. You do have to like click into the object and sort of like see what the padding is and do all that kind of stuff. So if you do that, like you do have to give the developers a little bit of training to sort of like show how like the tool sort of works, but it's very, very simple because they do have a code panel on the right-hand side where you can sort of like switch between the three things. So you've got design, prototyping, and code. And on the code thing, when you click on everything, it gives you the measurements of everything really quickly, and also gives you the CSS or the iOS or Android code to do that. That's like that's a very broad question. They're going to use a lot of different tools if they're actually trying to make something like responsive and do that kind of thing. So again, that's really highly dependent on the company. The company that I use, I used to work for, Auto Guru, we used a thing called Storybook. Storybook essentially is a way to display all of your coded components in one place so that you can test them and do UI bug fixes on those and run UI tests, like visual UI tests on them. So between, like, if you make a code commit, so you push some code up and say like, oh, this is the new button style, it will put the two buttons side by side and say, this is what's changed since last time. And then you can sort of then go, okay, well, which one do I use? So there's a lot of tools that that you could use. It depends how detailed your prototypes from Figma are as well. That's a really big question. I'm sorry that I couldn't be more specific there.
Maybe it's one of those things we can come back to on another webinar. Might be a topic in itself. David asked, which one of the apps would you say is best for user testing?
Yeah, so if you actually look at that design tools survey, they actually do have one for user testing. The scary thing there is that a lot of people are saying that they are not doing any user testing tools at all, which I hope means that because that's really scary if they're not, which I hope means that they're just using like Sketch or Figma to sort of show users, and like it's the prototype on their phone, for example. I hope that's the case. But there are other user testing tools out there like usertesting.com. And one that I've had a lot of success with a lot of my students is Maze. So maze.design, MAZE.design. That actually is like a really great one, and it recently just added Figma support, so I'm really happy about that. So it works with Sketch, works with Figma. I'm pretty sure it works with Adobe XD. I haven't looked at that, but it essentially like takes what you're doing and things to calculate like error-free rate, like things like expected path versus the actual path. Like did they eventually get to the goal, but they clicked like 50 different things before they got to the the end of the prototype, and they sort of like go through that. So that's a really great tool to play around with. And I'll just give the others a try. To be honest, a lot of them are the same, but they just have slightly different features. Again, like the 90% thing here is true, that they share a lot of the same DNA, but there's a little bit of quirks. Some of them have like pricing models that are only really good for enterprise level, but I find that Maze gives you, at least for a lot of students, like your first steps into user testing, and allows you to do that. But yeah, at an enterprise level, like at a company over like 100 people or so, you're going to start to get into like a lot bigger tools that do a lot more behavioral analytics and stuff like that by default. So yeah, maybe try some of those and see how that goes.
Thanks, Kieran. I think you have already answered this question as part of another question we had covered off earlier, but just to pull it out specifically, Kate had asked, I'm taking an Adobe Illustrator course online in my free time. I feel like it's something I need to at least be familiar with. What is your opinion on this?
Yeah, so for that, yeah, like I would say that you'd need to be familiar with it. It is like Illustrator is very much up until recently, like Figma, both Figma and Sketch didn't really have like the tools to do like what Illustrator can do. They are slowly like getting better and better, but Illustrator, in terms of like what the possibilities are, it's just, again, like it's a whole nother ball game, right? They can do things like blending like a shape to another shape. They can do like things where you can rotate an object around the same like axis and then like duplicate that around and then make something like perfectly equal all the way around. There's just some things in there that like you cannot do in Figma or Sketch for that matter. So if you're interested in like illustration and icon design, I don't think it's a necessary skill, but again, it's one of those like those broken like comb situations, is that you can always come back to it and say, oh, like I'm interested in that now. Like I really loved doing like icon design. I really want to dive into that, but I don't think it's like a core thing that you need to have. There are so many like different like icon designers out there that have been around for a very, very long time that are going to be like 10 to 15 times better than you at anything that you do. And what I sort of like look at is, and I include myself in that, right? I'm not trying to drag you or anything like that. But what I'm sort of saying is, there are people who spend their whole life just doing icon design, and that's literally all they do. And that, like, if you don't have that same level of commitment, like your icons are not going to be as good as theirs. And there are so many things where they are like $10, $15, $50, $100, $1,000 for an icon set, and they have literally like from like 50 to like thousands of icons that you can then choose. So what I always run in my head is, if I get, say, paid $100 an hour, is this resource going to take me, like, if it's $100, is this going to take me 1 hour to make? And if it's not, then I go, well, I'm going to buy this, right? It's a tax write-off. It's all those good things. So I always do that math, but you might have a passion for it, in which case, like, go for it. Like, that's, like, I would sort of say that, yeah, go for anything that you're passionate about. Like, start to learn. No matter how crummy you are at the start, it's always good to have that passion behind it. And yeah, like learn from the best. There's a lot of good Illustrator tutorials out there, but I definitely don't think it's a core skill to have.
Great. We've got a few minutes left, so maybe one or two more questions. But I did just want to say, Before we hop off, and whilst you're listening to Kieran answer the last few questions, please do drop into the chat channel any topics that you'd like us to cover off in future webinars. So things that have popped into your mind whilst you're listening, or things that you'd like to learn more about. And we will use that to try and pick our topics for into the future. But before we sign off, I think we probably do have time for one or two more questions. So the next one is from Claire. And it reads, if you're planning to attend UX Academy, what tools do you recommend learning beforehand? Like Figma, Sketch, Webflow, etc., or anything in general to hit the ground running?
Yeah, I think like as an absolute bare minimum, like because if you have no idea, like if you even want to do UX Academy, I would probably learn Figma, to be honest, because the reason for that is because it's a lot more accessible. So if you don't have a Mac, because again, like not everybody can afford a Mac. That's just a fact of life. So it's available. Like I can use Figma on my iPad, for example, right? Like, and it's not even that high powered of an iPad, but I can use it on there if I so wish. You can all, like, I would sort of suggest, yeah, learning Figma. One, because it's free, like for like a certain amount of projects, and two, it's a lot more accessible in terms of like what devices it can be used on, right? But that, like I said, those skills will be transferable to anything else. And then same with Webflow, but that's a different type of tool. I wouldn't classify Webflow and Figma and Sketch in the same sort of arena. But yeah, if you're wanting to learn a little bit more about coding, and like if you're wanting to do a little bit more freelance kind of stuff in the future, I would sort of suggest Webflow. Again, as that is free up until a point, to get yourself started, to see if you even like doing this as a job, right? Because if you think about it, like Sketch, if you don't have a Mac, that's like a couple of $1,000 plus the software, $100. So like it's like, and then plus the UX Academy, like, so all of that together, like that can be quite an expensive like decision to make. Whereas like Figma, like if you have something that has been made in the last 5 years, there is a high likelihood that it will run on it. Yeah, not guaranteed that it will, because it might be a crappy PC, but there's a pretty strong likelihood that it would. So yeah.
And then I think our last question for this webinar comes from Suzanne, and it's, do you need some statistics knowledge as a UX researcher?
Again, like there might be some people that are better than this at than you at this. So it really sort of like depends on what kind of statistics knowledge you're referring to. So if you're referring to like more like because I've worked with like data scientists before, and they're just like the nerdiest people ever. Like they're great because they love numbers. They're really into it. They really love getting into it, and sort of like talking about things like correlation versus causation and all that kind of stuff. They love getting into it. So again, I don't think it's necessary, because I personally haven't had any sort of like statistics course or anything like that. Everything that I've learned has been on the job, and like for that kind of thing, like I don't think you specifically need to do that as a thing. But like learning like the basics of like what the like mean, median, and mode is, and like what some of like the like terms like KPIs and stuff like that might mean. But again, like that kind of stuff, you'll come to learn like on the first couple of days, like working with any company.
Great. Kieran, thank you so much again for your time today. And thank you all for attending. It's really great to see your questions and to hear the things that you're interested in. I hope that today has been useful for you. It certainly appears like we have a strong interest in learning about animation and the handoff process. So we'll see how we can slot those into our upcoming topics. We hope to see you again in 2 weeks' time, which is when our next webinar will run. And please do, if anything else pops to mind that you'd like to hear about, you can drop it into this chat for the next few minutes, or you can write into us and just let us know and we'll add it to our list. But thank you all, and thank you, Kieran, and we'll see you in 2 weeks' time.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody, and see you later.